I'm going to talk about a topic that is honestly really not fun to talk about. It's become very divisive and political in our country. Depending on what side of the spectrum you're on politically, it might trigger certain emotions or thoughts or feelings that the other side is blowing it out of proportion. One side may not be taking it seriously enough. But regardless of where you stand, the organization that you represent is always at risk for an incident of workplace violence or an active shooter incident. Now, most organizations that I've worked with anyway, they have commercial general liability insurance. You have property insurance. You have workers' compensation insurance. And those policies are put in place to indemnify you in the event of a covered claim. And some of these policies have coverage for an act of workplace violence, and some of them don't. Some of them may provide a little bit of coverage here and no coverage there. And so I'll explain first how your existing policies may be leaving you exposed to costs that you're not really thinking about because, again, this is not a fun thing to think about, but from a risk management standpoint, I do think that it's necessary. So every organization I've ever worked with outside of startups, they have existing commercial general liability coverage, and I'm assuming your organization does too. A commercial general liability policy is going to pay for any visitors, clients, or customers within your premises that might be victims of an act of workplace violence or may not necessarily have a physical injury, but turn around and sue you because they want some trauma counseling and their suit alleges that you were not doing enough to create a safe work environment or a safe facility. A property policy, as you may know, provides business income coverage if you elect to purchase it. Business income coverage is meant to replace any lost revenue should there be a covered claim at your premises. Now, the reason I bring this up is because almost always, if there is an act of workplace violence or an active shooter incident, the police and sometimes even the FBI get involved and they come in and they shut your facility down. And how long it's shut down is really going to depend on the severity of the incident, whether or not a firearm was used, how many people were injured or killed in an incident like that. And your workers' compensation policy is in place to provide your employees who are injured with their medical costs, and if they can't come to work, replace that income that they're losing. But every single one of these policies has a gap in it, which, when I say gap, I mean a cost that is not covered. For example, on a commercial general liability policy, you have no coverage for any employees. And you may wonder why that impacts your organization because I just mentioned your work comp policy, but your workers' compensation policy will only pay for physical injuries that your employees sustain. Some carriers are starting to add coverage for mental anguish, but only if that mental anguish is accompanied by a physical injury. So if you have an employee who witnesses something like that happen, but doesn't have an injury themselves, you could have a benefit policy in place for them, but they're still going to have to make their copay. They still might have to meet a deductible, which is money out of their pocket. And so a work comp carrier will not pay for an employee's trauma counseling or grief counseling or any other type of therapy for someone who does not have an injury themselves. And on your general liability policy, you also have very specific limits of coverage that you can take advantage of. Most organizations I work with have anywhere between a $1 and a $4 million limit of liability per occurrence, meaning the most the carrier will pay for any single claim is between that $1 to $4 million, depending on the limit you have on your policy today. Now, depending on the severity of that incident, it could be 1 million, it could be 4 million. If there are lives lost that are clients, customers, or members of the general public, wrongful death lawsuits used to be settled for $1 million. That number is increasing rapidly. So even if you're at the high end of that spectrum and have a limit of $4 million per occurrence, which I should mention is very uncommon, that money is going to dry up very quickly. Now, you may have an excess liability policy over your general liability policy, but if you've been in the market for excess coverage in the last 2 years, you know that it's not only much more difficult to get that coverage, but it's also significantly more expensive, and even that is typically limited to $10 million. Beyond that, on that property policy I mentioned with business income coverage, there's specific exclusions related to government action, meaning that if the property damage your facility sustains is not significant enough, or the damage itself is not why your facility is closed down, but it's because there's an investigation taking place, you're out all of that revenue as well and have no insurance to collect for it. So just to summarize the gaps really quick, you could have employees that don't get injured that you're going to have to either pay yourself or are going to have to pay themselves for their own counseling, therapy, or what have you. You may have a facility that's shut down without any business income coverage to help make you whole. And on the general liability side, even if you have that coverage and it's a covered claim, if you exhaust those limits that you currently have, depending on how long it is from the day of that incident to the day your policy renews, you might not have coverage for that period of time. Now, this is at least the bright spot of this video. I don't want to say it's a positive because the entire video is kind of a bummer, but there is a solution here, and it's an insurance policy that is specifically written to respond to acts of workplace violence or active shooters. And that's what it's called. It's called an active shooter workplace violence policy. It fills in all the gaps I just mentioned. The trigger for the business income coverage is an act of workplace violence. There is legal liability costs, and the limits that you can get are not limitless, but you can get higher limits than your traditional liability policies you currently carry. Not only do you have coverage for employees that get physically injured, but if there's no physical injury, there is coverage for trauma counseling and therapy and things like that. The premiums for these policies are not that outrageous, and in exchange for the premium, not only do you get that insurance policy, but the insurance carrier, as well as myself and my team, have resources that we can provide you with. We can come in and do an assessment on your crisis preparedness, your crisis management plan, and the security of your facility. We can evaluate how likely your facility may be for an act of violence or for an active shooter incident. And the value of that is incalculable because you won't know until there is, hopefully never, but until there is an act of workplace violence. Or the services that we come in and provide could help prevent an act of violence from even happening, which is priceless. So one of the reasons I like to talk about this policy is because I primarily work with nonprofit organizations as well as healthcare facilities. And in my opinion anyway, both of those classes of risk have a significantly heightened risk of an active workplace violence or an active shooter. Most nonprofits serve people who need help in some way. They might need financial assistance. They might need assistance with mental health issues. They might be developmentally disabled. They might have any number of issues that they have come to rely on your organization for. Same thing with healthcare. You are providing people with a life-saving, in some cases, service, and the expectations that people have around companies and organizations that they rely on tend to get into the emotional realm. And when we have emotional expectations, we have emotional responses to those expectations, not to mention the fact that a lot of people served by these organizations may not be as stable as an average person. They may struggle with mental health. They may struggle with regulating their emotions and their reactions, which all heightens the chance that they may react in a way that you're not prepared for. Or you may be prepared for, but in some cases, there's only so much that you can do. So, with all that being said, if this is a policy or even a topic that you're interested in discussing more, don't hesitate to reach out to me. It's not a fun conversation, but from a pure risk management standpoint, it's a conversation that I don't think enough employers are having. So, give me a ring, send me an email, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to help however I can.